Well, the year was 1978. It would have been June. And Bishop Paul Washburn laid his hands on my head and said that I was ordained as a deacon in the United Methodist Church. It was then in 1981 that Bishop Paul Washburn, in one of his final years, then laid his hand upon my head again and shoulders and ordained me as an elder. Well, a lot has changed in those ensuing years for all of us. Some of the changes, of course, are silly and some are very significant. For myself, one noticeable one is I don't wear suits and ties very much, very often, hardly at all, you might say, except at funerals and weddings. And sometimes when someone sees me in a suit, they say, "Oh, you look really nice." I say, "Well, that usually isn't good news for somebody else." And I bring that up today because in the course of those 40 plus years, I have done many, many funerals. And so I want to talk about what I've learned in my journey with other people in that very significant time. Funeral memories, if you will. But not so much about the funerals themselves, but about the legacies that are associated with that very special time. So last week I mentioned how we can learn from people with whom we view the world very differently, which is an ongoing process for me, as I suspect it is for many. I'm still working on that. So this week I want to talk about what I've learned from being a part of people's lives as they were about to end their lives, and the commensurate conversations with the families who have just lost a loved one. See, there's really a lot to learn when you meet with people when they're dying, if you're willing to have that conversation. And then with their families after they've died. So these are the sort of questions that I have gleaned and kind of brought together over the years. Simple questions, you can imagine what they are. Like, well, what really matters to you? What's the message that you want to leave behind? You know, this is the conversation that I try to venture into. What's your legacy? And if they're of the faith orientation, like, do you have a favorite scripture verse? I remember one time asking a woman that, and she launched into, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord, on high. And I had to look it up. It's Psalm 84, but that was written into her life. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts, my soul yearns. Of course, I just remember what she started with, but this is what she continued with. My soul yearns, my soul longs for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. That just flowed out of her like the Lord's Prayer would flow out from many of us. And the reason I remember that was because there's something incredibly moving about seeing a woman who was near her death reciting those words, my heart longs for the courts of the Lord. So I've really never forgotten that moment. Her legacy, how did she want to be remembered? Well, it was easy for me these years later to remember because she hoped to be remembered as one who cared for people. And hope that her caring for people would be a witness that others might be inspired to then care for others. And it was no surprise that that's how she was remembered, because that's how she lived. She was the type who, when she went into the sanctuary, she would kind of survey the lay of the land, you might say, and see, is there someone new? Is there someone who's sitting by themselves today who maybe doesn't sit by themselves all the time? And she would just kind of say, hey, would it be okay to come and sit with you? And somehow she remembered birthdays and anniversaries. I didn't know how she did it. So, what was her legacy? Well, her legacy was one of faith, but not the type of faith was, well, she could quote Bible verses, or she was in the choir. What wasn't that kind of an expression of faith? Her faith resonated. Her faith sang out in her action, how she cared for people, how she looked out for people, how she gave herself to people. And so today, as we think about legacy, I have a couple of questions in mind, and simply, I would ask you, what is it that really matters to you? Or in a second one, how do you want to be remembered, right? Or I could ask, how do I want to be remembered, right? That would be for you saying it. What really matters to me? How do I want to be remembered? And then a third might be, what's the legacy you hope to leave behind? And that's a word we often don't think about, but I'm just trying to help us draw that word, into ourselves. Because in case you weren't aware of it, all of us are moving to that point, hopefully years from now, when we're going to punch out. We're gonna ride the great gospel train. we're gonna leave planet Earth. That day's coming, folks. And those questions become really important in how we live our lives in terms of what we leave behind on planet Earth. Now, I look for it. I didn't look very hard, but perhaps if has anyone else seen this? It says, like, if you want to, be able to carry your grandchild at 70, then at 50, you need to be able to do this. I don't know. Anyone else seen that? Somewhere I saw that. Yeah, thank you. I got one, yeah. Or, if you hope to be able to walk a mile without stopping, when you're 70, then at 60, you should be able to do this. Well, that's legacy building, right? It's thinking ahead. Life is not like a college test, at least not the tests I took. I didn't like those guys who were in business because they didn't ever study. They didn't study. They partied all the time. Then they went, I got an A. You didn't do that in chemistry. No, if you didn't study in chemistry, you failed chemistry, okay? And so you prepared for the test in the weeks before. Similarly, we don't build our legacy at the time of our death, right? We don't build our legacy at the time of our departing. We build it over the course of time. So over the years, I've been moved. I've been changed as I've heard the responses to, well, tell me about your loved one. Tell me their story. It's some of it's simple stuff, like where did they grow up? What was their life like when they were growing up? And to a spouse, what was it like to be married to him? What was it like to be married to her? Why did you choose him? Why did you choose her? And of course, if they have children, I say, hey, tell me about mom. Tell me about dad. Tell me about grandma. Tell me about grandpa. Oh, I remember doing a funeral years ago. And, daughter, we got together and said, well, tell me about dad. She knew where I was going. She said, I can't say one good thing about him. He hurt me so deeply. As Gina said, he left a legacy, right? A legacy of abuse, a legacy of abandonment. So at the small, as you might imagine, small graveside service, I simply tried to bring some words of healing, into her life. Now, Betsy will often comment to me how optimistic I am about people, and I think that really, I don't take credit for that in any sense, other than that I think that's been baked into me. The goodness of people has been baked into me over the years because of all the wonderful stories that I've heard of people, and some of the most magnificent stories are people I didn't know at all. And I just felt so blessed to be able to sit down. And oftentimes it was, the funeral home calling up and say, Dad wanted a preacher and do the service. And I've just been blessed over and over again to hear the stories of love and laughter and thoughtfulness. Stories of people who didn't have much money but would give what they had to a perfect stranger. Stories of those who, when their clients didn't have money, and dang, I can't remember the exact situation, but I've heard a couple of them, when their clients didn't have money to pay, they simply said, oh, don't worry about it. My life's going to go on. Just don't worry about it. Just forget this. They were in some trade. They went in and, maybe they're a plumber or something. They did the work and didn't charge them. See, those are legacy building memories. We talk about muscle memory, where if you do the same exercise, your muscles, they build up. Well, those are legacy muscle memories that were imprinted and left a lasting impression, a lasting respect for mom or for dad, or, maybe, or family, or a neighbor, because maybe we don't have what we might think of as the typical nuclear family or any semblance of that. They would just be a neighbor. Words that were shared. I recall one son who remembered his dad and said, the words that he remembered from his dad were, son, I want to let you know how proud I am of you. And this is years later now. He's talking about this as his dad has now departed. He said, those were the words that stuck. That was Dad's legacy words to him. He said, my dad looking me in the eye and saying how proud he was of me. And my goodness, legions stories of grandkids saying how Papa took them to games or took them to breakfast or what Granny did with them. So Moses, all right, just before his own death, 120 years old, there's a tiger. Bible says he was on the eastern banks of the Jordan River as the Israelites were about to go into the promised land. Remember, they had been brought out of slavery and bondage in Egypt. Moses had led them. They wandered around. I don't care if it was 40 years. I don't care. Listen, 20 years wandering around in a wilderness, it's going to seem like 40 years. I don't care how long it was. It was a really long time. But we know it was a generational time because Moses is worried that, hey, you guys witnessed something. You saw God's faith. You saw God's presence. You saw God's activity in the flesh as he delivered us from the Egyptians. And now Moses is worried that all this group is seen as a bunch of wandering, going around. People are fighting about, manna from heaven and food and all this other things. And so he gives them one final sermon as they're on the banks of this Jordan River looking into the promised land. He gives them one message, one charge. We find it in the book of Deuteronomy. It's here that we read Moses giving his final instructions. So he tells the story of them coming out of the slavery in Egypt. He reminds them of the 10 Commandments. And then in chapter 6, he gives what's referred to as the Shema. I've made a reference on that. It was those words ended up being foundational words for the Israel people moving forward. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then he says, as it's pulled into the New Testament, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and your mind. That's, as I said, that's different than the way actually Moses said it, but that was the way it ended up landing. Just like we don't say the Lord's Prayer, in case I won't pop anybody's bubble. We don't say the Lord's Prayer like it's in the Bible. Okay, we've kind of done a few little adjustments to it. Well, over time, they adjusted kind of Moses' Shema. That's how it's quoted in the New Testament. And then he goes on, though. See, this is the part that we want to remember today. He goes on after giving the Shema. He says, these are the commandments that I give to you. They're to be on your heart. These are to be words from your lips. These are to be on your heart. Impress these words on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Help it just be a part of your conversation. Help it to be a part of who you are. And what Moses is saying to the Israelites as they prepared to go into the promised land, he was worried that they would forget God. Not so much that generation who saw the mighty miracles and the great works, but those who had only kind of knew it secondhand, that they would forget about the God who delivered them and the God who would bless them. Moses knew that the children didn't have that firsthand experience that their parents had some 40 years ago. So he's saying, listen, when you get into the promised land, talk about your faith. Talk about your story. Share it with your children. Help them to know the commandments. Impress it upon their hearts. That's legacy building. So that's the legacy Moses was leaving behind, passing on the faith from one generation to the next. Many of us have children, and we've tried to do that, and some have welcomed the faith, and others have not. Not yet. My mom, bless her. So my brother and I, we walked very different paths, but my mom, to her final breath, she still had hope that my brother would one day kind of come around. She held on to that. So hers was no, not yet, faith. They may go, but just not yet. They might not go to church for years, but like my mom, we can hold out hope. And we keep living lives that they will see Christ in us, as Paul says, Christ in us, the hope of glory. We keep letting them know what God means to us. We keep letting them know how our faith has shaped our lives and how our faith gives us hope. So last week, Gina read a letter from her dad. Last week, it reminded me of a letter that a woman, her testimony was that she had drifted away from church, as many have. She thought it was somewhere around her college age. And so her mom is coming close to the end of her life. I mean, really close. And so she writes a letter to her daughter. And in that letter then, she says, the mom expresses what her faith means to her. So she's, like Gina read, she's leaving a legacy in a letter. She says, this is what my faith means to me. And she said, and I hope that one day you'll find meaning in your faith and in your relationship with God. And the woman said, that letter really irritated me. She said, when I first got that letter, she said, I didn't want to hear it. But as time passed, she said, you know what? Maybe she would consider what Mom had written. And so because of that letter then, and the way that her mom lived and the way that her mom loved, she ended up going back to church, giving her faith a try, and she got reconnected with her faith. So a big holiday is right around the corner, but not Thanksgiving for me. It's Christmas. And so as I've kind of mentioned how much I've learned from funerals here in the good old US of A, Christmas causes a bead of sweat on the brow of many because it's the dreaded, what am I going to buy for Christmas presents? Especially for those who, they've really got everything they need. They've got everything they want. They're trying to it's all of those things. And so the connection here for me is that one of the things I've noted about funerals is I never heard anybody say, well, man, they got me the best Christmas present. I got the greatest thing as a Christmas present. No, nobody, I can't recall anybody saying that. What they talked about were the memories and the experiences that they had. Again, we're doing that with our kids and our grandkids, and I know many of you are doing that as well. So with the West Coast boys, it might be, well, we're going to take them out biking, or this next time I think they're wanting to go to one of these trampoline places where you jump up and down and do all sorts of crazy things, or whether it's, buying Legos but then building the Legos with them, or, going to a place to play Frisbee tag or something. And the Nashville group, as some of you know, well, they've got 9 kids. And so, when you've got that size family and you're not a multimillionaire, you don't go out to eat very much. So the boys, their big thing is they like to go out for breakfast, okay? Now, they don't care how greasy it is. They just want the most plate that they can get. All right, so we go there. I try to eat what's there. And then we go to a place called Top Golf where you can hit a ball like forever. It's really a really fun thing. And so that's one of the experiences that we have done and will do. Now, Nana, she takes the girls to the foo-foo place for breakfast because, they want to do this, because they're not interested in terms of how many calories. They just want the ambiance, where the boys could care less about the ambiance. They just want the big boy breakfast. And then they go get their nails done or something like that. But see, that's all about building memories, right? So here's a memory that we had a couple years ago. So we flew into L.A., and because the West Coast, they couldn't live close. Some of you who talk about your kids living close, well, close for us is Nashville, okay? So we flew into, and then this place is an hour and a half north. This is why people want to live in L.A., because in an hour and a half, you can go from palm trees, you can go to here. So that's how we arrived, I don't know, whatever night it was. And so the kids, we'd bought them bicycles for Christmas, and so they were out riding their bikes. I didn't show that picture. And so the next morning, we woke up to 2 feet of snow. Okay. So that has instant memories made into it, right? Because the next picture you see, we have tons of pictures, of course, but the next picture that we have is, we dug snow tunnels and caves, and we just had so much fun. I didn't show the picture, like the car. That was part of the memory making, was we had to dig the car out, and so. It's making memories. It falls right in line with what Jesus said, right? That our lives don't consist in the abundance of our presents, presents, or our possessions, or what comes under the Christmas tree. That's my loose translation. It consists in the relationships, our relationship with God and our relationship with other people. So let's invest in those things, right, and make memories together. So I ask you, how are you planning, to make meaningful memories? Investing in relationships as you think about investing for life, whether it's families or whether it's your walking friends or whether it's your running friends or your health club, whoever you have in your circle, what's sometimes referred to as your circle of influence. Okay, a couple more legacies I want to draw our attention to. And one of those is how we model and practice generosity. Okay, so money is a tool. Perhaps we don't often think of it that way, but money is not an end in itself, right? Money is transactional. We use it for something. When properly viewed, money as a tool helps us accomplish things that matter to us. So many of us will be getting a letter from the church sometime this week, and if you don't know, let us know. Either way, it'll be available next week as a handout. It'll ask you to consider what commitment you'd like to make to support the life and ministry of the church in the coming year. But it's just not about making ministry possible. It's about saying with our pocketbooks, this is what's important to me. This is what matters to me. It's an act of devotion, if you will. It's a part of our generosity towards God and towards other people, and it's life-giving, right? Now, for some of us, when we think about walking uphill, that's not easy, or swimming upstream, that's hard, or for me, just swimming, period. Hearing Jesus' words of it's better to give than to receive, for some was like, no, I'd rather walk uphill, thank you very much. I'd rather swim upstream, thank you very much. It's better to give than to receive. Jesus, see, that is so countercultural for us. St. Francis of Assisi said, it is in giving that we begin to receive joy. It's in giving that we begin to receive meaning. It's in giving that we begin to receive purpose. So giving serves as an antidote, a vaccine, if you will, against narcissism, self-centeredness, all of those things. When we give to God and when we give to other people, who was it that said it's better to give than to receive? I think it was somebody named Jesus. So our giving is a part of our legacy. What we give to God and other people is one of the ways that we build a legacy. when we're investing in other people besides ourselves, we're helping other people. When what we're saying is that what really matters to us. So when I was the youth pastor, the associate pastor at the Hinsdale United Methodist Church, the youth group, is that really that time? No, good. Clock's not working back there. There was a very successful businessman. I mean, we're talking successful. Okay, so he had a home in Hinsdale, and he had a McMansion on the shore on Lake Geneva. Okay, so that's the type of, he had an apartment complex of 8 behind his house, so the grandkids could come anytime they wanted to. That's what we're talking about. Okay, so. Yeah, he had some money. So anyway, he let the youth groups come up. Each summer, we had a junior high youth group of about 40, and then we had a senior high youth group of about 50, and each of them got to come up. And so they'd be out. They had water slides and paddle boats and all these different things. Well, I got to have conversation with him. And, he had made his money in food additives. Now, food additive, I mean, that's the sort of thing. There's so many things that go on in the world that I have no idea of, And so he had made this monster money in food additives. And I come to find out that I knew he had helped build the Hinsdale Church. That was the 3rd church that he had helped build. By help, we mean basically he underwrote the whole thing. And then he'd gone on to build a church up in Lake Geneva as well. So as old age was catching up with him, I said, well, how do you want to be remembered? And as I stopped to think about it, of course he wanted to be remembered as a builder, all right. And he told me they taught Sunday school. I had no idea. After talking with him several times, they taught Sunday school. He said, I did that so I could encourage others. And of course he said I served on the finance committee. What church with any common sense would put him on the finance committee? But he also talked about how at his workplace he offered childcare. This was back in the 80s, friends. That was like basically unheard of. He offered his employees attention, love, care. He was, the type of boss where you go, man, I want to work at that place. He left a legacy with all of that of generosity. And he drove a car that was like in the 80s. He drove a car I think was maybe in the 60s. He was going to leave his money to things that mattered. So where did you learn generosity? Who taught you generosity? So for me, it was my mom a little bit, but it was more my lovely wife, Betsy. She is so generous. I could tell stories, but I've embarrassed her enough already today. But one of the stories that I think of is that I was aware of anyway. I'm sure there's so much generosity I'm unaware of, even in this own church. The young girls' classroom was having a food drive, and so they didn't have much. And so, as I recall, it was like but they still wanted to contribute, and so they brought like a sack of flour, sugar, or whatever. And the girl, she probably took that in. They were the recipients of the food drive too. They were the recipients as well. They got back. And so I think of our own food collection ministry here in the back and how we can participate in that. Or I think of a man named Charlie at Antioch. It was Alive and Growing. I still remember the name of it. And he was one of our fund specialists and lead people. And he had horses. He had 2 horses. He had a big piece of property. We're talking big piece of property where he rode his horses. But occasionally he trailered them and he took them, to someplace else to ride. Well, without telling hardly anyone, in fact, he didn't tell me. I found out through a circuitous route that to keep his pledge, which was a substantial pledge to the Alive and Growing campaign, he sold his horse trailer. And he just thought, you know what, I don't need that. What was more important to him was the legacy of that church and the ministry that he was such an integral part of building. All right, so King David was preparing for his own death, says to his son Solomon, hey, what really matters to me in my faith is, okay, I've got all this money that I have amassed, and I'm setting aside a lot of it to build this temple. So for David, though, it wasn't just a temple, right? If you read the Psalms, that's David. He was about finding joy in the Lord. He was about expressing his angst before the Lord. It was that building that he would have Solomon build was a way of reminding all of the people that God was to be at the center of their lives. And so he gives Solomon the plans, you might say, to build this. And that temple stood for 400 years. People would come and they would go and they would find God, in that place. And I think of the people who donated for this building, many of whom are no longer here, some of whom gave substantially in their passing and left the church and their legacy gifts, so that today that's helping us, kind of bridge ourselves to the future. So we are the recipients of many people's legacy gifts. All right, so there's one more important legacy, and we're drawing it up here. I think it's a legacy that I think it might really come into focus in the days, weeks, and months and years to come. Some of us have heard the old phrase, what did you do, Daddy, during the war? Right? Yeah, we've heard that, yeah. So we're likely approaching a time when we'll be given a special opportunity to care for the marginalized in our midst. And the action or the inaction that we take will be a part of our legacy that we leave. So what's the legacy you want to leave behind? In your love, in the daily things that you do, in the way that you care, what do you do with your resources? That will be your legacy. God, help us to live our lives in such a way that our legacy will be noted for the people that we've cared for, the life that we've modeled. Help us to be bold. Help us to grow in the grace of giving, with the assurance that it is in giving that we receive, knowing that in our giving we leave a legacy, knowing that in our action or inaction we leave a legacy. Bless us, O Lord, as we think about these things, knowing that one day too we shall punch our tickets out and go gather around the throne and sing glory, hallelujah, with those who have gone before us now and forever. Amen.